Good morning and welcome to Rising. Happy Wednesday. We've got another great show for you today. Niall is back in the hot seat looking gregarious in green.
I like the alliteration, Robby. I am back from a few days off. I was in Miami where I had a great time and I'm now refreshed and lots of news to get to, as always.
Yes,
so
indeed.
Let's kick it off. What is on your radar, Robby?
Lots of foreign policy to discuss today. We will start with Iran. President Donald Trump ordered the Treasury Department to resume maximum economic pressure against Iran on Tuesday with the aim of discouraging the Iranian government from pursuing nuclear weapons. Now, what made headlines, of course, was Trump's contention that Iran would be, quote, obliterated if they made the mistake of assassinating Trump or some other top U.S. official. Let's watch.
Why say that you're unhappy to sign it if it's Iran and their proxies who have threatened to retaliate against you and your team by killing you guys for taking out Soleimani?
Well, they haven't done that, and that would be a terrible thing for them to do, not because of me. If they did that, they would be obliterated. That would be the end. I've left instructions. If they do it, they get obliterated. There won't be anything left. And they shouldn't be able to do it. And Biden should have said that, but he never did. I don't know why, lack of intelligence, perhaps. But he never said it. If that happens to a leader, or close to a leader, frankly, if you had other people involved also, you would call for total obliteration of a state that did it. That would include Iran.
Now, headlines predictably emphasized those remarks from Trump as if there was something unusual or militaristic about them. But, of course, the U.S. would retaliate against a nation that took out our president. That's not surprising at all. We would do it, frankly, regardless of whether it was specifically set up by the president in question. The U.S. is not going to sit back meekly and defenselessly in the face of such a brazen, hypothetical attack. So that's not really news. What is news is that Trump does not actually want to inflame tensions with Iran. That was missed by the mainstream media, but it's a fact. Here he was making remarks just before the line about obliteration, in which he laments the reimposition of sanctions and asserts that he hopes we never actually have to go there.
We would have never had the problem. You would have never had October 7th. We would have never had the problem had the election gone a different way, which it should have. But this one, I think, more than made up for it. I think we're doing things and it shows it more than made up for it, much more historic. The Iran situation, hopefully, I'm going to sign it, but hopefully we're not going to have to use it very much. We will see whether or not we can arrange or work out a deal with Iran and everybody can live together, and maybe that's possible and maybe it's not possible. So I'm signing this, and I'm unhappy to do it, but I really have not so much choice because we have to be strong and firm, and I hope that it's not going to have to be used in any great measure at all. It'd be great if we could have a Middle East and maybe a world at total peace.
Now, that's a very different message than what you would casually assume if all you had read were the headlines assuring readers that Trump is promising massive destruction, even obliteration of Iran. On the contrary, Trump is reluctant to impose any sanctions on Iran. He wants peace between not just the U.S. and Iran, but peace in the Middle East and all over the globe. That's a good thing. Too often, U.S. foreign policy has been guided by people, both Democrats and Republicans, who see militarism as a first resort. Trump obviously has hawks in his own party, people like Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, Mitch McConnell. Those people have a reflexive appetite for conflict. Trump does not. He has a reflexive appetite for deal-making. Now let's see if the U.S. and Iran can get a good one. So, I saw the headlines about this, emphasizing, of course, the line about obliteration because it's typically Trumpy, that kind of thing. And, it's not... There's nothing weird about him saying, well, yeah, if they killed me, we would respond massively. That's a weird hypothetical to even ask the president. But if you read between the lines, what he's saying is that he would really like to have a deal with Iran and not have this increasing friction between the two countries. And I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I think on one hand, it is totally fair to draw attention to the fact that the obliteration quote got all the headlines and the clip that we just played got very few headlines. And you could certainly argue that the clip we just played maybe is more substantive. He's really arguing there that he doesn't really want to see this maximal pressure or maximum pressure applied to Iran. I think two things that I would cut against that slightly. I do think when you use terms like obliteration, someone like Trump, who knows how to command headlines, knows those kind of words are going to attract attention and knows that it is part of, I think, what he feels to be a sort of sign of muscularity in international relations. But the other point is, I guess I have some problems with seeing him as a peacemaker in relation to Iran specifically. I do agree that he is much less instinctively interventionist than a lot of people in the Republican Party. You mentioned Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, people like that, who do want to get involved in lots of places overseas. But it was Trump who pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. It was also Trump who ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, the leader of the Quds Force. That second killing is why people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo were under death threats. There was the whole related controversy where Trump pulled their Secret Service protection. So I think in relation to Iran, there are actually questions about whether he strikes a more overall belligerent tone than he does in some other places.
Well, there is definitely true that during Trump administration number one, I think sometimes his less hawkish instincts were overtaken by the fact that he was still surrounded by a lot of traditional Republican neoconservatives, like the people you just mentioned, like Mike Pompeo, like John Bolton. He earned, I think, rare criticism from MAGA world, including from Tucker Carlson, over the assassination of Soleimani. I remember when Tucker at the time was anchoring Fox News, said that that was a big mistake, and had on guests that said that. The question is whether Trump's second term, which will be guided by his own instincts. Now, I say that, but he put Marco Rubio in charge of the State Department, who really does come from that more traditionalist neoconservative wing, but we'll see. But I think it's refreshing to hear those things, to hear, it seems to be the thread with the tariffs as well. Saying that if you don't, make a deal with us to fall in line with American policy, you're going to be hit with these massive tariffs. But we don't actually want to do it, and there seems to be a recognition that this would be harmful to the U.S. as well. And so it's in the threats are in service of getting better relations. And you can critique that tactic, but it's very different from so many in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, some in the Democratic Party, who are like, no, we can't do business with these people. We need to. The point of the pressure is to eventually erode and wipe out that regime. Then people of my own foreign policy and your foreign policy say, well, can we really even do that? Would that be worth doing? How much pain does that cause us? Will the next people be just as bad? We start asking all those questions you're not supposed to ask when you're just in that bipartisan centrist neoconservative mold. I
do agree that Trump tonally can be quite different from the very hawkish Republicans, for sure. Now, for people who are now screaming at their computer screen or TV screen watching this, we have not forgotten about Gaza, and we will address that in the next segment because I do think that's a different point. But in relation to this and in relation to Iran, yes, it is certainly unusual to hear someone like Trump, who I think is often belligerent in his domestic rhetoric, being a bit less so in relation to Iran in this case.
Yes, indeed. We have not forgotten about Gaza. An interesting proposal was discussed yesterday. Niall has some thoughts on that, so stay tuned for Niall's notes. Niall, what's in your notes?
So today, Robby, Donald Trump is on my mind, and so too is the Irish writer Oscar Wilde. Wilde wants to find a cynic this way, a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. That description fits Trump to a T, and it always has. But now the president's cynicism and the grubby mindset summed up in Wilde's famous quote threatens the Middle East all over again. The president wants the United States to take over Gaza. He talks of taking ownership of the territory. He says this could transform Gaza into what he ludicrously calls the Riviera of the Middle East. To facilitate this, he is proposing displacing the Palestinian people who live there. Many of those people have just begun returning to their homes, having endured a 15-month military assault of colossal brutality from Israel. How many of the Palestinians does Trump envision displacing? Let's watch.
How many people are you thinking about?
All of them. I mean, we're talking about probably 1.7 million people, 1.7 million, maybe 1.8 million. But I think all of them. I think they'll be resettled in areas where they can live a beautiful life and not be worried about dying every day.
This is a bad idea for so many reasons it's hard to know where to begin. It's blatantly illegal, for a start, and it would almost certainly require the United States to use military force, something Trump himself acknowledged. Let's watch.
Mr. President, given what you've said about Gaza, did the U.S. send troops to help secure the security vacuum?
So Saudi Arabia is going to be very helpful, and they have been very helpful. They want peace in the Middle East. It's very simple. We know their leader and their leaders very well. They're wonderful people, and they want peace in the Middle East. As far as Gaza is concerned, we'll do what is necessary. If it's necessary, we'll do that. We're going to take over that peace, and we're going to develop it.
But let's not ignore Trump's central error here, the mistake from which all else flows. Trump sees Gaza as real estate, a patch of land that has a material worth but no other value. Gazans see it as home, with all the emotional weight that word carries. To him, it's a site to be redeveloped and sold on. To them, it's the land they have clung to against enormous odds and must never sell out. Trump just doesn't see that. There's no evidence he even understands it. When a female reporter yesterday called out to him, "But it's their home, sir, why would they leave?" he simply ignored the question. And in that ignorance lie the seeds of disaster. Trump's supporters say he is thinking outside the box, or that he's trying something new, or that he's engaging in negotiating tactics. Some have even made jokes about his Gaza proposal. David Friedman, who served as Trump's ambassador to Israel in his first term, cracked on social media, "Maragazo" or "Gaza-lago." Hilarious response, so long as you don't mind the President of the United States advocating ethnic cleansing and being willing to throw American men and women into harm's way to make it happen. And by the way, what happened to Trump's supposed reluctance to get involved in foreign military adventures that cost Americans blood and money? Even some usually reliable Trump allies seem to get this point. The Times of Israel reports South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham as reacting to Trump's proposal by saying he thinks, quote, "Most South Carolinians would probably not be excited about sending Americans to take over Gaza. It might be problematic." Problematic indeed. Human rights groups, Palestinian representatives, and Democrats here at home have blasted the plan. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland called the idea ethnic cleansing by another name. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut warned that Trump has completely lost it and that his plan would, quote, "set the Middle East on fire for 20 years. But it was a former Republican congressman who had just as powerful a response. Justin Amash of Michigan wrote on social media that if the US were to deploy troops, in pursuit of Trump's outrageous scheme, then, quote, "not only will the US be mired in another reckless occupation, but it will also be guilty of the crime of ethnic cleansing. No American of good conscience should stand for this." Is anyone listening to voices like Mr. Amash's? We need to. Right now, the best we can hope for is that Trump simply doesn't mean what he says on Gaza. If that's not the case, and if he does mean it, a new catastrophe looms.
Well, look, Niall, I don't fundamentally disagree with you at all. I don't think getting the U.S. more involved in Gaza is a good idea for a variety of reasons. I don't think there's much public will among the U.S., to do the kind of robust intervention that it would take for us to be responsible for Gaza or repairing Gaza or administering the governance of Gaza that would look something like the reconstruction of Iraq during the Iraq War. There is no public appetite to do that sort of thing again. So honestly, I think it's a non-starter on that basis. I agree with you that it would be some level of moral crime to sweep the Palestinians from their land without their willingness. Now, my maybe point of disagreement, although I don't know how you feel about this, look, I think if the Palestinians, if they don't have to, I don't have to speak about them collectively, if there are individual Palestinians who would like to live elsewhere now that Gaza is a smoking rubble, I think that's fine. And I think plans to negotiate with Arab neighbors like Saudi Arabia to take Palestinians who would like to live elsewhere, again, not force them from their homes, that should be fine. Just as with Ukraine under invasion by Russia, if there are Ukrainians who want to evacuate elsewhere in Europe, I think that's fine. as there were Syrians fleeing the Assad regime. To take the Syrians isn't to like endorse the actions of the Assad regime. It's just saying, well, we're happy to have you if you would no longer want to be in that war zone. I think that might ultimately be better for a lot of the Palestinians to make that choice, but I'm not going to make that choice for them or force it on them. I think that would be wrong.
So I think that Trump is talking about it being a collective thing. That clip that we showed said he's talking about all of them. He's not talking about 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 Palestinian families who think this is just too unbearable to continue with. The other issue about neighbouring nations taking them is that is proposed sometimes by Israeli politicians in a way that I think is really deliberately done to try to just dissolve or disintegrate or vaporize the idea of a Palestinian nation. In other words, you push people into Jordan or into Egypt and you say the Palestinians don't exist. And, you know, on the hard right in Israel, that is a view that the Palestinians don't exist, that there are only Arabs and Jordanians and Egyptians. So that's why I think I'm so suspicious of that. Also, I just think that it is insanity to get into the situation where the United States would be an occupying power in the Gaza Strip.
I completely agree. I mean, the reason Israel wants to do that is because Gaza, the Palestinian people, are under the thumb of a terrorist organization that has attacked Israel, and probably their view is, well, if the Palestinians cease to be a Palestinian people because they've been absorbed into several other countries, then the strain of terrorism that exists among this group gets broken up and absorbed into other groups of people, where diluting the penchant to choose terrorists to run them, right? Except the Israeli thinking.
Yeah, but
that's also the reason Saudi Arabia and Egypt, etc., don't want to take them in, because then they get a more radicalized populace.
Yeah, but except that, I mean, people like Netanyahu now and for several years have been explicitly opposed to the two-state solution. So the question is, if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and you don't want that to happen, how do you relieve the pressure? And one way of relieving the pressure is effectively destroying or dissolving the sense of the Palestinians as a discrete, separate people.
Yeah,
it's a terrible idea all around.
I agree. I don't want it to be the U.S.'s business. I don't think we know what's best for the region. I don't think we know what's best for the Palestinian people. I don't think we should pretend that we do. I don't think it would improve matters at all. It would be just akin to our other interventions in the Middle East. So we should find ways to be less and less involved in this distant region of the world, is what I would say. I think we agree on that.
Yep.
Lots more to get into today on Rising, including more on foreign policy. Stay tuned. President Donald Trump is now considering a slightly different kind of deportation. El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, made the U.S. an unprecedented offer on Monday, writing on X, "We have offered the United States of America the opportunity to outsource part of its prison system. We are willing to take in only convicted criminals, including convicted U.S. citizens, into our mega prison, CCOT, in exchange for a fee. The fee would be relatively low for the U.S., but significant for us, making our entire prison system sustainable."
Here's Trump's response last night.
If we could get them out of our country, we have other countries that would take them. It's no different than a prison system, except it would be a lot less expensive, and it would be a great deterrent. Send them to other countries. If we could go a step further, in other words, we're talking about getting the criminals out of our country that come in through other countries illegally, right? The illegal migrants, as I call them. Well, we have people that are just as bad as them in our country. If we could get them out, I'd be very happy.
You would pay El Salvador to
El Salvador
house
said that he would, wanted you to pay a fee for that. Would you pay that?
Well, it's a very small fee compared to what we pay to private prisons.
But under what authority?
And a very, very small fee. I don't know. We'll have to find that out legally. I'm just saying, if we had the legal right to do it, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio had paid a visit to El Salvador on Monday. He responded to Bukele's proposal on X, writing, "Very productive meeting with Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele. His commitment to accept and incarcerate criminals from any country, including from violent gangs like MS-13 and Tren de Aragua, will make America safer." In an extraordinary gesture never before extended by any country, President Bukele offered to house in his jails dangerous American criminals, including U.S. citizens and legal residents.
Before Bukele rose to power in 2019, El Salvador was a notoriously violent nation. In fact, it was nicknamed the murder capital of the world.
Bukele promised to crack down on his country's violence and has very clearly succeeded. His main target? Members of the notorious gang MS-13. According to El Salvador News, the country's homicide rate in 2024 was 1.9 per 100,000 inhabitants, making it the safest country in the Western Hemisphere.
Human rights advocates have criticized his harsh methods, however. Firstly, he has used emergency powers to conduct sweeping arrests, 81,000 in total since 2022. Prisoners also face lack of due process measures, and the State Department warned in a travel advisory of the country's harsh prison conditions. Overcrowding constitutes a serious threat to prisoners' health and lives, the advisory reads. In many facilities, provisions for sanitation, potable water, ventilation, temperature control and lighting are inadequate or non-existent. Bukele has showcased in the past what his prisons look like.
Here's a preview of CICOT, a maximum security prison in El Salvador that currently holds around 14,500 inmates. Conservative commentator Jake Beckett wrote on X, "Deterrence is the most important factor in maintaining law and order. Imagine the chilling effect on future crime in the U.S. when criminals realize they face the possibility of doing hard time in El Salvador." Boyd Institute fellow Michael Gurman said, on the other hand, "Send everyone with a life sentence to El Salvador will be much cheaper than here in the U.S. Love this idea."
Meanwhile, senior fellow at American Immigration Council Aaron Reichland-Melnick wrote on Blue Sky, "I don't care what Bukele says, they cannot deport Americans, and I'm glad the AP didn't mince words or say something mealy-mouthed. It just is not legal under any law, or any reading of any law, or any even weird little quirk of any law. It's not a thing."
Riot Platform's VP of Research, Pierre Rochard, posited, "Can we send Bob Menendez?" To which Bukele responded, "Yes, we'll gladly take him." Not a sympathetic person to spare the trip to El Salvador. However, I do agree that I don't think sending criminals, even very violent or dangerous criminals who are American citizens, to El Salvador is something we could legally do. I suppose that topic would need to be explored. I am not for that. However, if they want to take violent, illegal immigrant criminals, that is another matter and seems fine by me.
So a couple of things. It seems pretty clear-cut from everything I've read that indeed it would not be legal. The United States government cannot deport American citizens to serve prison sentences elsewhere, El Salvador or anywhere else. Now, you're right that the issue of non-citizens, migrants, etc. is different, and obviously Trump is in the process of trying to get various different arrangements in different countries for that. I suppose what I think of as the more distasteful element in all of this is the kind of glee with which people are imagining this idea, setting aside the legalities of it. Wouldn't it be great if we sent our criminals to serve hard time or to serve under particularly oppressive conditions in El Salvador? No, not really, no. I mean, there are genuine human rights concerns about those prisons. It's not as if the American prison system is some sort of walk in the park itself. There have been all kinds of very unpleasant and dangerous incidents in American prisons. So I don't really get this glee, even if it is Americans who have been found guilty of serious crimes. This idea that, oh, we can just ship them off to El Salvador and this guy can take care of them, I don't find that useful or constructive.
Yeah, El Salvador presents an interesting case. I mean, there are trade-offs between liberty and safety. As someone who cares about liberty a lot, I've watched the videos about this El Salvadorian prison and what they've done there and the kind of, mass incarceration of people associated with these gangs. And it does make me a little bit uncomfortable. On the other hand, El Salvador had a massive violent crime problem that this tactic of significantly locking up people associated with gang activity and putting them in this prison has helped reduce their violent crime rate substantially. So it's it comes down to your priorities. What do you want to do?
Well, it has, but I mean, that is the danger, isn't it? That we go down this road of saying, well, for the sake of security, we'll just lock people up in a mass scale or without due process, which is what the Salvadorian president appears to be doing. That's why he's getting all this criticism. I also wonder if this whole offer to the Trump administration is not simply a means of currying favor and avoiding the negative implications of his own behavior. I mean, kind of Latino.
You say he's getting criticism, but my understanding is he is incredibly popular in El Salvador because he has brought down the violent crime rate. He was reelected with, I think, like a supermajority of popular support because there was a mandate to do something about this. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the deterrent effect of locking people up, because one of the tweets we've read mentioned that. My recollection from research I've read about how much of a deterrence effect there is for prison time is that certainty and immediacy of serving a prison sentence is found to serve a deterrent. It's not really the length of time. So what would be ideal, and this doesn't necessarily jive with, but let's say we could set aside due process concerns or legal concerns. I'm not actually setting those aside.
No problem.
What would be, you commit a crime, you go to jail immediately. It does not necessarily forever, but that there is a swift, or you reoffend, jail instantly. That, according to researchers, has a deterrent effect. What problem in our system is the system is so overcrowded and it takes forever. There are a lot of people, and this is a due process violation or liberties violation, people waiting in prison for their trial date who haven't been convicted of anything yet. Now, people could argue, well, you have to do that for people who've been, if this is multiple go-rounds with the legal system, if there's video footage of them striking someone on the street, probably they do gotta wait in prison for their date, even if they haven't been convicted of that crime yet. But it takes so long, and that actually works against the deterrence effect. The theory being some people commit crimes and saying, well, if I get caught, we're gonna be arguing about this in court for months and months and months and years. So you're not, the immediacy of the punishment doesn't get in there, and that's what has the deterrent effect.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think that there should be due process and people can have the right to appeal and all of that.
I do too.
But the point is, in relation to the capacity of the system, if we had more judges, if we had a better system to funnel people through the criminal justice system and find them guilty or not guilty, then that process of delay would be much reduced, and we would not have the difficulty of people who often cannot afford bail being in detention for too long a time, not convicted of any offense.
Maybe our system would be less swamped if we had all the violent illegal immigrants boarding a plane to El Salvador.
Well, maybe it would not, Robby, because maybe those people make up a very tiny proportion of the criminal offending population here.
Coming up on Rising, 2 media outlets have been called to testify before a House committee. We'll find out why. The new chair of the FCC has his way. Public airwaves will lose government funding. It's music to my ears, but we're going to have a debate about it. The FCC chair, Brendan Carr, wrote a letter to the heads of PBS and NPR last week stating that I am concerned NPR and PBS broadcasts could be violating federal law by airing commercials. In particular, it is possible that NPR and PBS member stations are broadcasting underwriting announcements that cross the line into prohibited commercial advertisements. It went on to say, to the extent that these taxpayer dollars are being used to support a for-profit endeavor or an entity that is airing commercial advertisements, then that would further undermine any case for continuing to fund NPR and PBS with taxpayer dollars, Carr wrote.
Piling on is the new House Subcommittee Chair, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who called on NPR and PBS to testify next month. The Georgia Republican, in a letter, said, as an organisation that receives federal funds both directly and indirectly through its member stations, NPR's reporting should serve the entire public, not just a narrow slice of like-minded individuals and ideological interest groups.
MTG's letter to NPR CEO Catherine Maher cited the network's decision to not report on the Hunter Biden laptop scandal in October 2020. In her letter to PBS CEO Paula Kerger, Greene pointed out that its reporting on Elon Musk's hand gesture during President Trump's inauguration celebration was clearly false.
NPR said in a statement Monday, "We welcome the opportunity to discuss the critical role of public media in delivering impartial, fact-based news and reporting to the American public." While PBS said, "We appreciate the opportunity to present to the committee how now more than ever the service PBS provides matters for our nation."
Meanwhile, Elon applauded MTG on X, saying, "Excellent action by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Federal funding for public broadcasting currently totals $535 million per year."
This allocation is dispersed to local PBS and NPR stations across the country, benefiting those outlets in all states. PBS released an internal poll this week that shows that 65% of Trump voters think the public broadcaster is either underfunded or adequately funded. The poll also shows 82% of voters, including 72% of Trump voters, valued PBS for its children's programming and educational content. Saving Big Bird again, Robby. That's the key question.
If those polls informed those Trump voters of what Marxist propaganda these outlets are responsible
Marxist
for producing.
propaganda.
No, look, okay, let's stay, you brought up Big Bird. Let's stay on the children's educational entertainment part of this. You can't possibly argue that is a need that only PBS can meet these days. Like, there are so many great children's educational entertainment properties from other major networks and entertainment properties, from just content creators on YouTube. You can just open up your laptop, and I know not everybody has a laptop, but a phone, anything to get a really good child's. There's so much content now available. I think the argument that the government needs to fund this because the market is not necessarily meeting this need is really weaker than ever. I mean, it's just YouTube, it's in particular, is saturated with educational content that's quite good for kids. That's how a lot of my nieces and nephews spend some of their free time.
No, I get that. Here's the thing that I think is the problem with NPR and PBS, among other things. If the government is going to decide to fund broadcasting, you need to either, in my view, go the whole hog or not at all. In other words, you need to do what the British government used to do.
Go whole Miss Piggy or not.
Yeah, exactly. That's very good. I like that reference. But look, the whole point is you have to put the money in to make it really exemplary. And then you can make the argument that the public broadcaster does things that commercial broadcasters could or would not, because the individual items of coverage would not be profitable. So then, for example, one of the difficulties, I think, in American television broadcasting has been a great depletion over the years on foreign news reporting, because it's very costly and it often just doesn't make money. That's something that a well-funded public broadcaster could do. But this $535 million that we give to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting only covers 15% of public TV costs and 10% of public radio funding. So a lot of the airtime is spent with the famous, telethons or pleas for donations.
Viewers like you.
Which nobody finds very fascinating TV. And in the meantime, the overall content is perhaps distinctive for its ideological lean. I would certainly agree that NPR leans culturally liberal to a massive degree. I don't think there's really any disputing that. But is it distinctive in the sense of its quality? Is it providing something that the marketplace doesn't provide in that way? I honestly find that a hard argument to make.
Well, I agree. Catherine Marr, the CEO of NPR, is someone I've written about quite a bit. She got some attention several months ago, maybe it was almost a year ago, for comments she had made, or for Yuri Berliner, a longtime editor, person of significance at NPR, left, joined Bari Weiss's Free Press, wrote a big, very piece that drew a lot of attention to itself for criticizing her leadership and editorial choices. This is someone who I would say believes in every kind of, cultural, progressive thing. A lot of things I have criticized, saying, I don't know exactly which ones of these she specifically got it, but lab leak denial, Hunter Biden laptop, just very, she gave some speech about how Wikipedia relies on too many Eurocentric sources of information, that kind of really, really progressive woke stuff that that is well represented at a whole host of other news organizations. And it's like, you know, does the government really specifically needs to fund that? I know it's not in the scheme of things a lot of money, although then you run into, if you say that about literally everything the government spends money on, it's like, well, it spends money on so many things. No one of those is the thing breaking the bank. But if you're not going to say no to anything because it's either it's too little or it's too much, so it's too expensive, we can't do anything to cut it, well, then you're never going to cut government spending.
Right. I mean, I think there are two separate arguments here. One is the argument about public funding of broadcasting, which I have a bit more sympathy for your view than you might have expected. I mean, unless you go, as I say, the full whack and fund something really exemplary. But then there's a separate topic then about someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene setting herself up as the arbiter of these things. You and I disagree about the Elon Musk salute, which attracted so much attention. But her argument is to describe it as looking like a fascist salute or whatever is clearly false and shouldn't be done.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
I would not agree with that, and I think it is a perfectly legitimate view to put forward. And I notice since President Trump came back into power this time, there been an increasing tendency to simply label as false anything with which he or his loyalists disagree with. So, for example, the White House Communications Office now sends out a daily or near daily email complaining about fake news. And their proof that the news is fake is simply that often that the person who is being described disagrees with the perception or description of them. That's not fake news. It is not rebutting something if someone says, this person is acting in an inappropriate way, and the person says, no, I wasn't. You haven't. Yeah, that doesn't make the original report fake news, which I think is the Trump administration's view.
Well, coming up next, Libertarian conservative commentator Hannah Cox joins us to talk about USAID and what they were funding. Stay tuned.
President Trump kicked off his second term taking a sledgehammer to U.S. institutions, among them the U.S. Agency for International Development. Dozens of senior officials and thousands of contractors have been put on leave or laid off, and its employees around the world will be put on administrative leave Friday. They also have been ordered to return to the US. The late President John F. Kennedy established USAID in 1961, and it was intended to provide humanitarian assistance to other countries. But reports from the White Coat Waste Project reveal years-long alarming activity.
As Libertarian conservative commentator Hannah Cox highlights, the agency shells out billions of dollars annually to respond to crises like poverty, diseases, famines, and natural disasters. But there's more than meets the eye. Taking to X on Monday, Cox posted, quote, "The White Coat Waste Project obtained proof of this almost 2 years ago, so per usual, the government agency funds the massive problems they claim to then need to fund the response to, gut them." Joining us now to dive deeper into USAID's dismantling is Hannah Cox. She's the co-founder of Base Politics, Substack, and owner of Athens Media. Welcome, Hannah.
Good to see you, Robby.
So I think we buried the lead there a bit. What you highlighted on X was, I think is going to be shocking to many people watching, that part of the funding for what has been criticized as dangerous scientific research in Wuhan, China, was done not just by NIAID, the NIH, the other funding agencies, but was done by USAID for EcoHealth Alliance. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it's interesting because the White Coat Waste Project is an organization that works to stop taxpayer-funded animal torture. The U.S. government is actually the top funder of animal torture in the world. And so they inadvertently got caught up in this entire mess a few years ago when they happened to be tracing gain-of-function research and found that it was illegally happening in the Wuhan lab, because gain-of-function research is animal torture. And so they started ringing the alarm about this, but of course it was buried by the mainstream media and by the government for many, many years. So it's been hard getting eyeballs on it. But what's interesting as well, Dr. Fauci and the NIH, the NIAID have caught a lot of the brunt of this, deservedly so. There have been many government agencies that have been doing this exact same kind of funding, and not just before COVID, but after COVID as well. As I pointed out last year, USAID was continuing to give tens of millions of dollars to these very same labs well after the pandemic broke out, and nothing was happening to stop it. And so I think it's interesting to watch the weeping and gnashing of teeth by Democrats who claim to care about stopping public health health disasters, who claim to care about things like animal torture, coming in and rabidly defending this organization. And really, this is just the tip of the iceberg. What the White Coat Waste Project discovered about USAID is how it operates in a myriad of sectors. They essentially take our dollars, they pass them through quote nonprofits that are nonprofits in name only. Those government contracts then get handed out through those nonprofits to people who are well connected, and it's just a way for them to launder money for their friends and inadvertently get it back in their own pockets. So this is how you can expect to see them moving in a ton of other sectors. But we know they were giving money to Eco Health Alliance, which was a very shady nonprofit that had been involved with this kind of risky research for years. We know that they were using that as a pass-through organization in order to do gain-of-function research in a country while it was illegal here in the United States. And so I think if you really start to look beneath the surface of this organization's operations, you can expect to find that all over the globe. We know that they have also been doing shady things like propping up propaganda campaigns in places like Ukraine, controlling the media, trying to put things on social media that turn people against their own governments. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that we freak out about when we even hint that it might be done here by other countries to us. But this is what our taxes have been funding with this organization. It's not about humanitarian aid whatsoever. It is a part of the deep state apparatus and has been working to carry out goals that have nothing to do with actually uplifting people in other countries, much less empowering the American people here.
Is it really fair to say that it is not whatsoever about humanitarian aid? I mean, as I understand it, they do literally provide food in quite a number of cases, do they not?
They do it, but they do it with strings attached, right? They come in and they always have ulterior motives for the kind of funding they are provided. And you can talk to many people in other countries who have been speaking out about this over the past couple of days as this has started to make headline news, saying, we don't want this aid. We don't want these people here. We don't want them involved in our country. So yeah, you might see them come in and offer to pay to build a school, but it's because the school is going to be pushing the curriculum that they want to have in there. You might see them offer to come in and build wells, but there's always going to be strings attached for things that those
hold on, Hannah. There's always going to be strings attached. I mean, is it your contention that every single food parcel USAID provides has some sort of ulterior motive attached? They never do it for humanitarian reasons, in your view?
No, I don't think the government ever does anything for humanitarian reasons. I think that that is a guise. Of course, there might be people working within the organization who are daft enough to believe that that is what they are about, that's what their cause is. But we've seen enough of the reports and enough digging into their actual activities just over the past couple of days alone to know that there is no excuse for this organization to exist. I think it's absolutely insane to suggest that humanitarian aid must be carried out by the government in general. We already know that the private market does that far better, far more efficiently, and at far greater rates than what the government does. Anytime the government gets involved in quote charity, I mean, you can expect to see pennies on the dollar actually making it to the cause. It ends up getting passed around to their friends. And that's why Democrats are truly upset about USAID getting dismantled, because this has been a cash cow for many of them and their friends who work at these nonprofits, these NGOs, and then also their contacts who are working with those organizations and getting very cushy handouts after those grants are dispersed. So this is a way for them to move money around. It's very, very lucrative for them. And I absolutely do not think that this is something that is truly helping the poor in the world. And I also, furthermore, don't think it's doing anything to help the American people, which is what Trump's election was about. I am not a Trump supporter, but I adamantly understand the concerns the American people have with the vast amount of wealth that is being shipped out of our country overseas when it needs to be kept here. We have numerous problems that need to be dealt with. I think that is one of the positives about Trump and his administration. So even if USAID was doing an amazing job, I would still say we need to rethink about where our dollars are going and look at there are ways that private industries can take over this while we focus our tax dollars on helping the American people. But it is unquestionable that that is not the bulk of what USAID is doing. And I think the risky research and perhaps being involved with the creation of COVID is, of course, like the most egregious thing on the table, the worst charge against them. But we know from other things that have been put out by the Trump administration this week, they've been funding things like trans musicals and DEI curriculum in classrooms. This is a absolute joke. They have no business being involved in this, no business sending our dollars over there. And I think that on top of everything else, the amount of meddling they are doing in other countries and in their governments is certainly something that could incur blowback for us. We are tired of regime change, we're tired of wars, and we're tired of the deep state that helps to push those things along by getting involved in these kind of activities in the first place. We wouldn't want it done to us, and we shouldn't be using our tax dollars to do it to others.
if we're going, I could see the argument that if we're going to be, green-lighting these projects, giving this aid and assistance around the world, is there not an argument that it should be attached to strings, and that the U.S. government might want, if we're just giving it away for free, what is the political reason to do it at all? Shouldn't we not try to get some kind of favorable policy from other countries toward our government?
I think ultimately the answer for me and the vast majority of people who are in the Trump camp right now is that we shouldn't be doing it at all. This is not how Americans want their tax dollars spent. We want our tax dollars used here. We want charity to be applied to people here who need it. And so it's great if you want to, of your own volition, take your money and go help people in other countries build up their infrastructure, build up their people. That's not the responsibility of the American people, and people are fed up with having that placed on their shoulders at a time where they can't even buy houses, they can't afford their groceries, they feel like they have fewer and fewer prospects for their future. They are absolutely sick of this kind of thing happening, and it does not happen. It cannot happen within government without seeing the kind of corruption that we've seen with USAID. That is why the vast majority of people who believe in limited government have that stance, because they know that anything government touches will always be corrupted, will always have perverse incentives, will always have less accountability than when it's done by people in the private market. And so that's where these things should be housed. I think what the US government should be doing is using our tax dollars to actually improve our own infrastructure, to improve our own society, to clean up our own streets. It's inexcusable for the American people to have to consistently be expected to put themselves in the back seat in order to enrich the rest of the world. So yes, if we're going to send money overseas, I think it might be appropriate to have some strings attached, but those strings attached should not be what they've been, which have been goals that have empowered the military-industrial complex. They have been goals that have come in and allowed us to come in and indoctrinate other countries and to run into their elections and get involved with how their governments are operating. All of that is stuff that puts us in more danger in the long run. It's not something that makes the American people safer. Yeah. It's not something that has ever panned out. This is the agenda that was unilaterally voted down with Trump coming into office. People are sick of the neocons, they're sick of the nation building. They do not want this in this country. And while I'm a libertarian, I can agree with them on that. I think that that's exactly what the focus needs to be on. I think they have spoken loud and clear with the votes against Kamala Harris and Biden, because this was that agenda on the left for many, many years. It used to also be the agenda on the right. That's why many people have said we have a uniparty in this country. This is really the first time we're getting a taste of what it looks like to have something fight back against that.
Hannah Cox, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
The NFL appears to be sending mixed signals when it comes to its DEI initiatives.
Sources told The Athletic that the NFL would be axing the slogan "End Racism" from the Super Bowl end zone. They will instead have "Choose Love" and "It Takes All of Us."
Commissioner Roger Goodell, however, had this to say earlier this week.
Listen, we got into diversity efforts because we felt it was the right thing for the National Football League. And we're going to continue to those efforts because we've not only convinced ourselves, I think we've proven ourselves that it does make the NFL better. So we're not in this because it's a trend to get in it or a trend to get out of it. Our efforts are fundamental in trying to attract the best possible talent into the National Football League, both on and off the field, as I said previously.
NFL spokesperson Brian McCarthy told The Athletic that the New Orleans terror attack, Los Angeles wildfires, and the deadly plane crash in Washington, D.C. were part of the reasons why the league decided to go a different route with the end zone slogans.
The NFL began adding phrases to their end zones on players' uniforms after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Sports and political commentator Keith Olbermann wasn't too happy about the move, to put it mildly. Guess what, NFL? If you're against Stop Racism, that means you're for racism. F you and every one of your advertisers.
Some mild-mannered commentary from Keith Olbermann. Blaze media contributor TJ Moe wrote on X, DEI ignores talent, promotes group identity instead. The NFL is going to go the way of the NBA. Outkick founder Clay Travis wrote, congrats to the NFL on ending racism, big achievement. Gotta admit, didn't think racists were going to change their minds based on end zone slogans, but I was wrong. It worked. So, the end zone apparently said end racism. I wasn't paying enough attention to know that. Was that
Weren't
always
looking
the case
You weren't
in all?
scrutinizing the NFL ends.
Is that in all Super Bowl games or all games?
I think it's been all recent Super Bowls, I think, or
recent-
several recent Super Bowls.
Yeah. So we've ended end racism.
Yes.
Great. Fantastic.
So I, as you might guess, have a different view of this than you do. Or
But if it's just going to, well, go ahead and say your
Which is that
first.
the argument that, oh, well, you put a slogan in the end zone and therefore you haven't ended racism, therefore you shouldn't put the slogan in, is not true. That's not how change happens. Change happens by people making repeated attempts in small ways and large, ripples of hope, to use RFK Senior's famous metaphor, that people, by standing up for the right thing repeatedly in all kinds of different ways, ultimately creates the kind of propulsive force for actual change.
Right. The criticism of this kind of thing is that it's very performative. It's very, why end racism and not end poverty or end war or end sexism or like, especially if there's only be one message, is that even the most pressing cultural or social issue? It just seems very reactive to a single news event, the George Floyd event, in a almost cynical way in which they're trying to say, look at us, we're a corporation, we get it, we're so progressive guys, we just love us too, we're good.
See,
Overlook any other issues you might have with us because we're against racism. Look, we wrote it on the thing.
No, but here's the thing about that argument, Robby. Someone like arguing from your perspective says, well, is end racism really more important than ending sexism or ending poverty? But actually, I don't think you would support ending poverty or ending sexism in the end zone either. And so I think that the problem is that those arguments, is that why are you elevating this one thing above the other thing, typically comes from people who say you shouldn't do any of it.
I think that's true in a lot of, I think, to be fair to that point, I agree with you, like when they go, well, all lives matter, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, but there was a specific problem here we're trying to address. This is a little different, though, because there's a finite amount of space. Like, you only have room to write one thing. So there, I think it is fair to invite the question, well, why are you writing that instead of something that, what you want to write, pay people fairly, or what? Like, there's anything you could write. It just seems very reactive to the news. And
but wouldn't you criticize? I mean, I'm not actually trying to be.
I just don't think it should say anything political.
Well,
really.
exactly. That's the whole thing. You don't think it should, and I think it's perfectly honourable that it should. Now, we could dispute what exactly is the bigger ill. Racism, I think, clearly still is a scourge in this country that causes very real problems. If you want to write end sexism instead, I've no objection to that. But I don't think that it is a bad thing for those kinds of messages to be sent out. And I also don't think, one of the first quotes we read there from the right was something to the effect of DEI ignores talent. That's not what DEI does. DEI, at least in its most useful manifestations, allows talent to come through that would otherwise have been ignored or sidelined because of reasons of traditional biases.
Well, if that's all we mean by DEI, then I'm all for it. But what many conservatives are trying to purge when they take aim at DEI is the opposite of merit. If it's just outreach to people, I mean, I've said this before in the program, it's just outreach to people who don't know about opportunities, but who would otherwise qualify, that's all great. And diversity can be a good thing in many contexts if we're considering all sorts of diversity, including where you grew up and how you feel about things and what your actual ideas are.
Well,
but
and
if it's
also
just
other
that
issues
people,
like disability and so forth, which are not racial or gender issues. But anyway,
yes,
go ahead,
but if we're giving preferential treatment to people for reason other than strict merit, if we're taking, if you go to an admission system, you're taking people who scored less well on the entrance exam or whatever it is, but because you want to construct a more artificially diverse racial or gender or whatever it is populace, that is what we mean by DEI, and that is what we're getting rid of. That and also the training component, the seminars, which I think even most liberals now have concluded are a waste of time and are very patronizing and not scientifically well-founded.
Some of the excesses of the seminars I would agree with you on, but I think that the argument about lowered standards and so forth, that came up, for example, in the recent plane crash here in Washington, D.C., which was a very tragic incident, and Trump immediately started blaming DEI for that. A, there was no evidence in that case at all. But secondly, and this came up with one day when our friend Amber was in your seat, the whole testing process there was not about lowering standards for admission. It was replacing a previous measure that had included things like work experience in air traffic controlling. There are private air traffic controllers, then there are the FAA air traffic controllers. And the DEI effort there was intended to redress a historical imbalance to enable people who were performing very well on a test measuring traits to be recruited. There was no lowering standards there.
It sounds like you've looked at this more closely than I have. Are you referring to I mean, there is a lawsuit over this. I agree with you that I don't think it has to. I don't think this specific incident has to do with any of this. As far as I can tell from the plane crash over the Potomac last week, seems to be due to just way too many planes and helicopters sharing the same narrow airspace. And if you talk to helicopter pilots in DC, all they'll say is, yeah, we've been warning forever that this is dangerous and something like this could happen. It's infuriating. I don't think it actually does have anything to do. But the lawsuit over, 10 years ago or something like that, the FAA's, my understanding was, yes, they scrapped a testing, or they scrapped an admittance thing that was resulting in perfectly qualified people get accepted, and then they realized that was a mistake, and now all those people have sued. So I don't...
No, that's not how I would characterize it. I think that what happened is people sued because they had failed a new test, which was intended as a multiple choice test measuring things like decision making and so on and so forth. They failed that test. They are then suing, arguing that that test was biased against them. I don't believe that it was. It was not intended, your racial identity was not determining one way or another how you performed on that test. So I would dispute the characterization of that.
All right, well, we'll have to get into that one a little bit more thoroughly at a later date. Next up on Rising, we'll have an interview with a research fellow, Nick Cleveland, about think tanks and their lack of transparency. Stay tuned. Think tanks have become hotbeds of influence on both the right and left, with many policy experts calling them home. But these think tanks rely heavily on outside funding to keep their scholars, fellows, and researchers refining their expertise. Who funds them?
According to Nick Cleveland-Stout, over a third of all think tanks, especially those focused on foreign policy, like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and American Enterprise Institute, are entirely opaque, meaning they do not disclose where their funding comes from. He's developed the Think Tank Funding Tracker, which is a repository keeping tabs where top US think tanks get their money. That can include the American and foreign governments, as well as Pentagon contractors. He's been tracking where this money comes and goes since 2019.
Here to shed light on think tank funding is Nick Cleveland-Stout, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks for joining us on Rising.
Hey, great to be here.
So what do you think are the consequences for policy of these think tanks being able to not disclose where they're getting funding, and what I presume in some cases are them getting funding from governments or quasi-governmental organizations?
It's sort of the great unknown, right? Like, we don't know who the donors behind a lot of these dark money think tanks are, and that should concern more people. Like, these are the think tanks that are testifying to Congress, that are frequently quoted in media. American Enterprise Institute, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, just to name a few of some of the most prominent. But I think instead of sort of being ostracized, like, these think tanks are invited to testify and into these kind of prestigious circles, and that's concerning, because what we know is that funding matters. It can play a role in the end products of what think tanks do. We know in some cases, like, it can obviously lead to self-censorship, but in some cases it can even lead to outright censorship. And I think first and foremost, we need to get to the bottom of who is funding these think tanks.
And is there any way at all of finding that out? I mean, I know we noted in the introduction that a lot of these think tanks are entirely opaque, but is there any even circuitous route to finding out at least some level of what their funding sources are?
As of right now, we sort of have to rely on investigative journalism or even think tanks themselves sort of accidentally letting slip. You know, American Enterprise Institute accidentally mentioned at an event a couple of years ago that they're funded by Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. In theory, there's one rule that's kind of on the books that could shed some light, and that's the Truth and Testimony rule in Congress. It basically is a form that asks think tanks to think tank experts to, when they're testifying to Congress, to disclose certain information. You know, are you funded by foreign governments? If so, which ones? Sort of common sense questions like that lawmakers should at least have some information about when they're considering whether to take someone's advice into account. However, at the top of that form, it asks the question, are you testifying in a personal capacity or an institutional capacity? And the way that it's interpreted right now is a lot of experts will say, oh, I'm just testifying in an individual capacity. And so that sort of divorces them from the institution, as if that were even really possible, because, this is like who you're relying on to put food on the table.
You work for the Quincy Institute. We have a lot of experts from the Quincy Institute on this show to talk about foreign policy. Both Niall and I are largely fans of a more non-interventionist approach to foreign policy that is often represented by the Quincy Institute. I saw in some of your commentary on this issue the kind of I guess reflexively interventionist or pro-war bent of a lot of DC-based policy think tanks that are able to keep their supporters secret, which I should say, by the way, I guess I support. First Amendment private organizations, I would support their right to keep private or keep secret who is supporting them, to keep that anonymous, even if I disagree with them. But is there something in that lends itself to, I guess, being unable for the public to criticize people who are advising time and time again interventions that are not popular among the American people?
Absolutely. I think it is a large factor in what militarizes our foreign policy. Not only do you have foreign governments that are interested in expanding the U.S. security architecture so that they're under our umbrella, but you also have defense companies that it sort of dovetails with the interests of these defense company donors that also get a windfall if we give a security guarantee to Saudi Arabia, for example, or invade Iraq. Like that was an idea that was sort of cooped up in a think tank as well, the Project for a New American Century. So kind of down the line, a lot of this militarized foreign policy, it oftentimes originates or is propagated or platformed by think tanks that their donors do benefit from a lot of these policies. And so that's the kind of conflict of interest that we want to call out. And we build out this database, which I encourage folks to check out, thinktankfundertracker.org. We want good faith journalists to be able to do a better job, essentially, of calling balls and strikes and disclosing those sorts of conflicts of interest.
To that point, Nick, I don't genuinely ask this question in any kind of gotcha way, but I imagine people watching will wonder, does the Quincy Institute publicize its donors?
We do, yes. That is an important question. We do publicize our donors, and the same way we're saying we should call balls and strikes. We see them. We encourage folks to come to our website and do the same. We have all of our donors. We have all kinds of donors listed there, and folks can take issue with whatever they want. But the point is that all of that's public. That's step one, is getting that information out there.
One thing we've covered a lot on Rising is threats to freedom of expression, censorship of social media being recommended by this network of ill-defined, very confusing, quasi-governmental nonprofit organizations, some of them foreign. And then I find out time and time again, oh, and by the way, the State Department supports them. Like, the State Department is supporting an organization that is trying to extort social media platforms into taking down the speech of people who oppose war and other things. Is that another? Can you speak to fears of government funding some of these organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, U.S. government funding of think tanks, that was sort of the original model. Like the rise of federally funded research and development centers. That's sort of what gave rise to think tanks in the first place throughout the 50s and 60s, kind of the height of technocracy. In the 70s and 80s, you see it switch more towards special interests, foreign governments, corporations, defense companies, but federal funding still persists, and it largely persists to create a certain degree of independence from the U.S. government. It's a lot easier for the Department of Defense, for instance, which is the largest agency funder of these think tanks, to cite a study that originates outside of the government, at a place like RAND or the Atlantic Council, than if it were an internal study. It's just easier to cite. It creates that distance, a layer of bureaucracy to a degree. And another thing I'll say on that is that, if the U.S., if we are using taxpayer dollars to fund a lot of these think tanks, I think that a lot of taxpayers might want to know who else is funding that think tank. And so, if a think tank is hiding these sources, but still receiving that benefit from the U.S. government, not only in the form of funding, but also tax breaks, these are 501c3s, we should know about that.
Nick Cleveland-Stout of the Quincy Institute, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The first openly trans actor nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress is under fire, but not for why you may think. Emilia Perez star Carla Sofia Gascon has been outed as allegedly racist and xenophobic for past social media posts. The controversy erupted the end of January after Canadian journalist and podcaster Sarah Hagi uncovered a slew of Gascon's ex-posts going back as far as 2016, which she railed against Muslims, the George Floyd protests, even the Academy Award themselves.
In a post from July 2017, Gascon wrote, quote, "Islam is becoming a hotbed of infection for humanity that urgently needs to be cured." And as recently as 2020, Gascon posted, quote, "Until we ban religions that go against European values and violate human rights, such as Islam, under the protection of freedom of worship, we will not end part of the huge problem we face." There are multiple other tweets, but you get the idea.
The controversy could derail the awards prospects for the film, where Gascon plays a Mexican cartel leader who fakes their death and undergoes gender-affirming surgery.
Many critics have lauded the film as groundbreaking, and it's racked up an impressive number of awards on its way to the Oscars stage. Last year, the film took home the Jury Prize at the 77th Cannes Film Festival, where it premiered.
After the ex-posts came to light, Gascon deactivated her ex-account, citing death threats, and issued an apology to fans on Instagram. Reading in part, "The first thing I would like to do is to sincerely apologize to all those who have felt bad about the way I have expressed myself at any stage of my life. I have many things to learn in this world. Forms are my main flaw. Life has taught me something I never wanted to learn. It is clear to me that no matter how much your message is one, without using the right words, it becomes another."
Her statement did little to quell the backlash, as even some of her co-stars have now distanced themselves from Gascon's statements. Co-star Zoe Saldana, when asked her thoughts on the incident, had this to say.
I'm still processing everything that has transpired in the last couple of days, and I'm sad. It makes me really sad because I don't support and I don't have any tolerance for any negative rhetoric towards people of any group.
And we didn't include in that roundup my favorite of this person's tweets, in which they said they don't understand so much about the world war against Hitler. He simply had his opinion about Jews.
Oh, Lord. I mean, I don't know where you even go with that. Many people are saying...
Where you go is to the Academy Awards, baby! 13 Oscar nominations for this film.
It's just terrible. I mean, it's just terrible.
So what is funny about this is that I haven't seen this movie.
Nor have I.
Every person I know who has seen this movie has told me it's one of the worst movies that they have ever seen. Just setting aside any political subtext or liking or disliking the message, liking or disliking the actors and actresses, they said it is a truly terrible, it sounds like a disastrously bad movie. And Latino people hate it. They hate it. They find it culturally appropriative.
That's a rather sweeping statement.
No, there have
Sure?
been there have been articles written about how the Latino community is receiving this movie very badly because it's a French director who hates musicals making a musical movie about the Latino community that has this, pro-trans message, which is why liberal Hollywood is embracing it and saying we want to celebrate a trans artist, throw awards at them. But the one they've selected is a Hitler apologist.
I mean, it's just...
I am cackling with glee.
You're highly amused by it all. I'm
Highly
just so amazed by the tweets, which I didn't know about until this morning, that I really don't have anything to say about it, except we shouldn't be giving awards to Hitler apologists or to people who are obviously Islamophobic.
We shouldn't give awards to people whose movies are bad, is my first criteria, so maybe we do disagree.
Well, I agree that we shouldn't, but I think over the history of the Oscars, we could probably pick out quite a few movies that we thought were bad.
I like to celebrate the art and the artist.
Yes.
So if I think it's a terrific performance by an otherwise utterly insane, unhinged, crazy person of whatever, our actors have crazy views. I don't appreciate their views. I wouldn't even care, but it is both a terrible movie, again, I haven't seen it, but from what I've heard, not well received by the people who are supposed to like it, and the icing on the cake. The swastika on the cake.
It's quite a big swastika, judging from that tweet that you read out, which is just unbelievable. I mean, look, obviously it is not good to be extolling people. You need to be careful who you praise, in case you find that...
if it's Hitler.
Especially if it's Hitler, that is just not a good thing. I was all set to make an unusually libertarian argument for me, which is to argue that criticisms of religion, as in the religious doctrine itself, I find a bit different from obviously racist or sexist things, because I think it is sometimes criticism of what religions hold to be true are completely valid. But once you get into saying Muslims are all, or Jews or Christians are all, whatever.
Right, I agree, which is why I ad-libbed allegedly in saying that it was Islamophobic or whatever, because, I take, like a Christopher Hitchens, Bill Maher view, that criticism of the doctrine of a religion is perfectly fine if it's not too sweeping, but then we read what the actual tweets were, and they were pretty bad, and there's no massaging
no
Hitler,
getting around that.
The Hitler reverence.
No. Absolutely not.
Fun stuff. I don't know if I saw. I don't pay a lot of attention to award shows. I don't see many movies a year. I watch a lot of TV. This year I've seen Gladiator 2 and Wicked. I hated Gladiator 2. It was one of the least enjoyable movie experiences I've ever endured, actually. And I loved Gladiator. Gladiator 2, so bad. Don't see it.
Did it get any Oscar nominations?
I don't know if it got any Oscar nominations. It got costume, we're being told. Well, the costumes were pretty good. Costumes were good. Wicked was fine. It was good. It's not the greatest thing ever.
So
fine.
Movies are a terrible blind spot of mine. I'm reasonably good on music, but movies, I can't honestly remember the last movie I went to.
What's up for the Oscar Best Pictures? Let's see.
While Robby's researching the Oscars there, is this woman, Carla Sofia Gascon, is she still, they can't rescind the nomination, presumably. She's nominated and that's
That would be cancel culture.
It would be cancel culture, but maybe they'll have to cancel her given her pro-Hitler position. I just find it sort of bizarre that they cannot actually pull it back at this point and that it's all going to go ahead.
Where is Best Picture?
Is she going to attend the Oscar ceremony? I would imagine a lot of people, particularly in Hollywood, wouldn't be that eager to sit beside her given those.
All right, I have the Best Picture list. Honora, I don't even know what that is. The Brutalist, I don't know what that is. A Complete Unknown, that's the Bob Dylan
movie,
one.
which I should go to see and haven't done yet.
Conclave, which I've heard about, but I didn't see. Dune Part 2, I did see Dune Part 2. I thought it was fantastic, so that would be my preference, I guess, of these. Amelia Perez, the movie we're discussing. I'm Still Here, I don't know what that is. Nickel Boys, I don't know what that is. The Substance, I don't know what that is. And Wicked. So, I've seen 2 of these movies, and Dune Part 2 would be my choice.
I don't think we'll be supplanting Ebert and Roper anytime soon in this authoritative breakdown of the Best Picture nominees, but there we go anyway.
All right, that does it for us today on Rising. We're having all too much fun, so it's time to say farewell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content, and for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can get your podcast.